Steve Miller thought he had the perfect life until his wife, Vanessa, betrayed him with another man. But when the affair spirals into a deadly confrontation, a shocking murder turns everything upside down. As Detective Anna Harlow digs deeper into the mystery, she uncovers a web of lies, revenge, and dangerous secrets that lead to a chilling conclusion no one saw coming. Will Steve's dark past catch up to him, or will Vanessa's cold indifference be the key to exposing the truth? In the heart of Chicago, Steve and Vanessa Miller lived what appeared to be the perfect life. The couple was well known in their social circles, wealthy, outgoing, and seemingly in love. They attended every high-end event, hosted lavish dinner parties, and often seemed to have it all together. To the outside world, they were the epitome of success and happiness. However, behind closed doors, their relationship was far from ordinary. What the world didn't know was that Steve and Vanessa had become part of a secret community, a community of swingers who engaged in casual and open sexual encounters with other couples. At first, the idea had intrigued both of them. They saw it as a way to spice up their marriage, to step outside the confines of traditional monogamy and explore new experiences. The arrangement worked for a while. They both found excitement in their secret meetings and felt closer to each other in ways they hadn't before. But soon things began to shift. For Vanessa, the boundaries of their agreement started to blur. She grew more and more attracted to one of the men in their group, Brian. He was confident, charming, and shared a connection with her that seemed to surpass the casual encounters they had. At first, it was just physical, but over time their meetings became more intimate and emotionally charged. As Vanessa's feelings for Brian deepened, Steve remained blissfully unaware. He continued to enjoy the swings and the excitement that came with it, thinking everything was still as it had been. But behind his back, Vanessa's affair with Brian was growing more serious. She kept the relationship a secret, but there were signs that Steve could no longer ignore. Vanessa became distant at times, and Steve noticed she was spending more and more time with Brian. He began to feel a sense of unease, but he pushed it aside, convincing himself that nothing was wrong. After all, their lifestyle was built on the idea of mutual freedom, and he trusted his wife, until one night, everything came crashing down. Vanessa found herself pregnant. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. She had never imagined it would go this far. The affair with Brian had spiraled beyond what she had expected, and now she was carrying his child. Panic set in. She knew that telling Steve would destroy their marriage, and the thought of leaving him for Brian was overwhelming. But what other choice did she have? The guilt she felt for betraying her husband was heavy, but the love she felt for Brian was undeniable. She wanted to run away with him, to start fresh without the burden of a life she no longer wanted. Vanessa's pregnancy marked a turning point in her secret life. Her once carefree and adventurous spirit gave way to worry and anxiety. She knew that things would never be the same, and the facade they had built was slowly starting to crumble. Vanessa's mind was torn between Steve and Brian, between the life she had built with her husband and the new life she envisioned with her lover. As the days passed and her pregnancy progressed, she knew the truth could no longer stay hidden. She had crossed a line, and the consequences would soon become impossible to avoid. What she didn't know was that Steve had begun to suspect something was amiss, and soon, the dark secrets of their twisted lifestyle would begin to unravel in a way neither of them could have predicted. As Vanessa's pregnancy progressed, the tension in the Miller household grew unbearable. Steve, once the life of every party, had become a man consumed by suspicion. The smiles he once wore at social gatherings were replaced with tight-lipped expressions, his eyes constantly searching for answers. Vanessa, ever the picture of grace and charm, had become a stranger to him. He noticed the subtle changes in her behavior, her late nights, her frequent disappearances, and the quiet conversations she had on the phone, her voice laced with a hint of nervousness whenever she thought he wasn't listening. Steve's initial ignorance had been replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The growing distance between him and his wife became too glaring to ignore. Every time she came home late, there was a new excuse: a dinner with friends, a late meeting for work, or a visit to her mother. But Steve could feel the lies, the gaps in her stories that never quite added up. The unease gnawed at him, eating away at his trust, and he started to question the life they had built together. His suspicions led him to do something he had never considered. He began to track her. At first, it was subtle. He would check her phone when she was in the shower, glance at her texts when she wasn't paying attention. But soon he escalated, installing tracking apps on her phone and keeping an eye on her calendar. What he discovered sent him into a spiral of anger and disbelief. Vanessa had been seeing Brian more than he had realized, and their relationship wasn't just a casual fling. It was something far deeper, something more serious. Steve's heart raced as he read the messages between Vanessa and Brian, their conversations intimate and filled with plans for the future. He had never imagined that the woman he had loved and trusted could betray him in such a way. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. The truth shattered him in a way he couldn't have prepared for. His mind raced with images of Vanessa and Brian together, the thought of them building a life without him tearing at his soul. But what was even worse was the realization that their lifestyle, one that he had once embraced, one that had been his idea, was the very thing that had led to his downfall. With every piece of information Steve uncovered, his heart hardened. The more he discovered about Vanessa's affair, the more he felt like an outsider in his own home. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed cold and empty. He could no longer look at Vanessa without seeing the lies behind her eyes, and the pregnancy that had once seemed like a gift now felt like a constant reminder of her betrayal. In his pain, Steve began to formulate a plan. He couldn't let this go on. He couldn't sit idly by and watch as his wife built a future with another man. He knew something had to be done, but he wasn't sure what. The anger and jealousy that bubbled up inside him were overwhelming, and with each passing day he felt himself slipping further from the man he once was. He thought about confronting Vanessa, but every time he considered it, his mind was clouded by visions of what might happen next. Would she leave him? Would she choose Brian over him? The fear of losing her, of losing everything, pushed him to the brink of madness. As the days turned into weeks, Steve grew more desperate. The life he had once known, one of trust and love, was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. Vanessa's affair had changed everything. It had destroyed the foundation of their marriage, and Steve knew that there was no going back. The man he had been was gone, replaced by someone consumed by anger and the need for revenge. The relationship they had once shared seemed like a distant memory, fading further with each new discovery. The couple that had seemed so perfect to the outside world was now unraveling, their secret life more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The discovery of the affair was a turning point for Steve. No longer the oblivious husband, he was now a man consumed by betrayal and rage. The once happy home had become a battleground, with every moment spent together feeling more like a ticking time bomb. Vanessa's pregnancy, once a source of joy, now weighed heavily on him. The child she carried was not his, and with each passing day, Steve's resentment grew. But what hurt most was that he couldn't bring himself to confront her directly. He knew the affair was far beyond his control, and yet he felt the need for some sort of closure, something that would bring an end to the torment eating away at him. As Steve's anger reached its peak, his thoughts grew darker. The more he thought about Brian, the more he despised him. Brian had not only taken his wife from him, but had also stolen his sense of security, his trust in the very foundation of his marriage. It wasn't just an affair anymore, it was a betrayal of the life they had built together, a life that had once seemed perfect. Vanessa had chosen another man over him, and the thought consumed him. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine, that their marriage could be salvaged. Driven by a need for revenge, Steve began to make plans. He reached out to Brian, feigning a desire to resolve the situation and make peace. The invitation was simple, a meeting to discuss things face to face. Steve assured Brian it would be an opportunity to clear the air, to sort out the mess that had been created. He wanted Brian to think that he had finally come to terms with the affair, that he was willing to accept it. But deep down, Steve's plan was much darker. Brian, unsuspecting of the trap, agreed to meet. Steve arranged the location, an isolated spot near the outskirts of the city, away from any prying eyes. It was a place neither of them frequented, a place that would allow Steve to confront Brian without any witnesses. The closer the meeting came, the more Steve's nerves flared. He was torn between the conflicting emotions inside him. Part of him wanted to believe that this could all be resolved. Part of him wanted to believe he could find a way to fix things with Vanessa. But the other part of him, the part that had been wounded so deeply by the affair, was determined to make Brian pay for the pain he had caused. When the day of the meeting arrived, Steve felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. As he waited for Brian to show up, his heart raced. This was the moment of truth. There would be no going back once it was done. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but in that moment, all he could think about was the betrayal and how much he wanted to end it. Brian arrived on time, unaware of the danger lurking. The two men exchanged words, pleasantries that masked the tension hanging in the air. But as the conversation continued, Steve's anger simmered just beneath the surface. He spoke in calm tones, pretending to be the man he once was until finally his temper broke. Without warning, Steve attacked. The rage he had been holding back for so long poured out of him in a frenzy. He grabbed Brian by the throat, throwing him to the ground. The struggle was violent and quick. Steve's hands trembled as they tightened around Brian's neck. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just pure, unbridled fury. When it was over, Steve stood over Brian's lifeless body, his chest heaving with adrenaline. Blood stained his hands, his clothes, but all he could think about was the relief that washed over him. The man who had stolen his wife, the man who had brought him to the brink of madness, was now gone. Steve stood in the silence, unsure of what he had just done. The weight of the murder hung over him like a heavy cloud, but there was also a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. But even as the initial rush of power faded, a cold, creeping realization settled in. What had he done? He had taken a life, and the consequences were far from over. He couldn't go back now. The murder would set off a chain of events that would unravel everything: his marriage, his future, and the fragile life he had tried so desperately to hold on to. The worst part was that Steve knew, deep down, that this act of violence would only drive Vanessa further away from him. She had been planning her future with Brian, and now there was no turning back. The days following Brian's murder were a blur of panic and guilt for Steve. He returned home in a daze, still reeling from the violent confrontation he had just ended. As he walked through the door, he could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The house that once felt like a home now seemed like a prison. Every step he took echoed through the empty rooms, a constant reminder of what he had just done. His mind raced, replaying the brutal encounter over and over again. He couldn't shake the image of Brian's lifeless body, the blood pooling on the ground beneath him. It felt unreal, as if he had somehow stepped outside of himself and become a mere spectator to the madness that had unfolded. Vanessa was there, sitting in the living room when Steve returned. She looked up, her face betraying no hint of the chaos that had consumed Steve just moments earlier. She was still pregnant, still carrying the child that was not his, and yet she seemed so detached from everything. For a moment, Steve considered confessing. He thought about telling her what had happened, about the violent confrontation with Brian and the final, irreversible act he had committed, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew that no confession could erase the years of betrayal. No explanation could take away the dark shadow now hanging over him. Vanessa didn't ask about the strange look in Steve's eyes, the way his clothes were stained with dirt and blood. She simply continued with her day, as if everything were normal. To her, the events that had unfolded were nothing more than a series of manipulations: her affair, the pregnancy, Steve's newfound coldness. She was already planning her escape, preparing to leave with or without him. She had no intention of staying in the house with Steve, not when the child she carried was Brian's, and not when she had already made up her mind about her future. But that night, something happened that neither of them could have anticipated. A knock at the door shattered the uneasy silence in the house. Steve froze, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. His mind immediately flashed to Brian's murder, the possibility that someone might have seen something or discovered what had really happened. He could feel the panic rising in his chest as he moved toward the door, unsure of who or what awaited him on the other side. When he opened the door, he was met by Detective Anna Harlow, the lead investigator on Brian's murder case. Steve's stomach dropped, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He had no idea how Detective Harlow had found him so quickly, but the fear that had been gnawing at him for days was now undeniable. Detective Harlow wasted no time. She introduced herself and informed Steve that they were investigating Brian's death and had some questions. Steve's mind raced. He knew that this moment would define everything: his future, his freedom, his life. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and the reality of his actions began to settle in. He couldn't lie his way out of this. The evidence was there, and the investigators were already closing in on him. Detective Harlow's sharp eyes were scanning him, looking for any sign of guilt or nervousness, and Steve could feel himself cracking under the pressure. The detective's questioning was subtle but persistent. She asked about his relationship with Brian, about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and about his feelings toward the victim. Steve did his best to maintain his composure, but he could feel his pulse quicken with every word the detective spoke. He tried to stay calm, to keep his answers simple and unremarkable, but inside, his mind was spiraling. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained eerily quiet. She watched from the background, her eyes darting between Steve and Detective Harlow. She could see the tension in Steve's face, and she knew that things were about to fall apart, but she didn't say a word. She simply waited, her thoughts focused on the future, on the life she would soon begin with Brian's child. As the investigation progressed, Detective Harlow's suspicions began to mount. Her questions grew sharper, more pointed, as she pieced together the puzzle. She had already noticed the strange behavior in Steve, his quick and defensive responses, his discomfort under her scrutiny. The more she dug, the more the cracks in Steve's story began to show. But it wasn't just his answers that raised alarms, it was the atmosphere of the house itself. There was something off, something hidden beneath the surface. Steve's attempt to maintain control was slowly unraveling. The detective's investigation, combined with the growing evidence, meant that his secrets would soon be exposed. What Steve didn't realize was that his actions had already set off a chain reaction that would soon lead to his downfall. The murder he had committed was only the beginning, and soon, everything he had fought so desperately to protect would be torn apart by the very lies he had created. As the days wore on, the tension between Steve and Vanessa reached a breaking point. Detective Harlow's investigation was gaining momentum, and Steve could feel the walls closing in on him. The carefully constructed facade he had built was crumbling, and every move he made seemed to push him further into a corner. The sense of dread that had consumed him since Brian's murder was now overpowering, and his every thought was dominated by the fear of being caught. Vanessa, however, seemed more distant than ever. She had already started making plans to leave Steve, to start a new life with Brian's child, away from the chaos that had unfolded. She no longer cared about the house they shared, nor did she seem to have any concern for Steve's well-being. She was cold, calculating, and focused only on securing her future. Despite Steve's internal panic, Vanessa continued to act as though nothing was wrong, hiding behind a mask of indifference that only deepened the divide between them. The detective's relentless pursuit of the truth left Steve with little room to breathe. Each day, new questions arose, and each answer he gave seemed to tighten the noose around his neck. Detective Harlow's instincts had been right. She could tell there was something off about Steve's demeanor. He had been unable to hide his guilt, and his desperation only made him appear more suspicious. The inconsistencies in his story were becoming harder to ignore, and Harlow was now convinced that Steve had played a key role in Brian's death. But the detective wasn't the only one growing suspicious. Vanessa had begun to notice the subtle signs of Steve's unraveling. The way he would suddenly tense when she entered a room, the nervous glances he shot at her when he thought she wasn't looking. She knew something had changed in him, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. It was as if the man she had once known had been replaced by a stranger, someone haunted by his own actions. Yet despite her growing awareness, Vanessa chose to remain silent, watching as Steve's world slowly crumbled around him. One evening, after a particularly tense interaction with Detective Harlow, Steve returned home feeling the weight of everything crashing down. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and anger. He knew he couldn't keep up the charade much longer. The thought of prison loomed over him like an inevitable fate, and he found himself standing at a crossroads, unsure of how to proceed. In a moment of overwhelming panic, he made a decision that would change everything. He needed to flee, to escape the consequences of his actions before it was too late. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Steve packed a bag, leaving behind the life he had known. He knew that by the time Vanessa or Detective Harlow realized what he had done, he would be long gone. The thought of running away, of leaving behind the life that had become a suffocating trap, seemed like his only option. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions had already sealed his fate. The weight of his decisions, the murder, the betrayal, the lies was something he could never escape. As he slipped out of the house, Vanessa sat in the living room, unaware of Steve's departure. She had finally decided to leave, to move forward with her new life. But as she looked around at the house that had once been their home, something stopped her. It wasn't guilt, nor was it a desire to stay. It was simply the realization that everything had come to an end. The life she had once known with Steve was gone, replaced by the aftermath of their mistakes. Vanessa didn't know where Steve had gone, nor did she care. She had already made her peace with the situation, convinced that her future with Brian's child would be far better than the shattered past she was leaving behind. But deep down, a part of her knew that the repercussions of their actions would follow them, no matter how far they tried to run. Detective Harlow, however, was not far behind. She had been watching the Millers, and when she learned that Steve had disappeared, it only intensified her determination to solve the case. The investigation was far from over, and Steve's flight only raised more questions. But what Harlow didn't yet know was that the truth was more complicated than she had imagined, and the dark secrets of the Miller family were only beginning to unravel. In the end, both Steve and Vanessa had been consumed by their own desires, their own lies. The affair, the murder, the betrayal, they had all led to this moment, where everything they had built together was reduced to ashes. And as they both tried to escape the consequences of their actions, they could never outrun the truth.